10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast, episode 303. Hey everybody, welcome back to episode 303 of the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us yet again. This week we are going to continue our series on learning tunes and some background on how to get good at the skills required to learn all the songs that you will learn in your career as a jazz musician. So as usual, just wanted to mention, if you're new to the podcast or if you've been a listener for a while, we are a listener-supported show, which means we do not use any advertisements on the show. Instead, we rely on small donations from listeners just like you to keep the show going. And the way we do that is through the Patreon platform, and we do deliver PDFs and audio examples with every single episode so that you can get the most out of this jazz education. And you can find that and sign up to become a contributing member by going to our website, 10minutejazzlesson.com, clicking on one of the Patreon banners to get yourself signed up, whatever tier you would like, and you get instant access to all of the materials that we have ever put out. So go to our website, 10minutejazzlesson.com, click on one of the Patreon banners, get yourself signed up today. Quick shout out to our new patrons this week. Thank you to our new $5 patrons, Dan and Martin. And thank you to our new $3 patrons, Virginia, Rainer, and Steve. Thank you guys so much for joining the over 350 members that we already have over there. And of course, if you have been a member for months or years, thank you. You keep this show going, and I hope you are enjoying all of the jazz education materials over there. All right, so let's continue this series on learning tunes. So what I want to do is, I want to do two things. I want to cover two more of those common chord progressions that you will hear in hundreds of jazz standards, two that I couldn't fit into last week's episode. And then I want to close out the episode by talking about the first step to hearing form, and how we can do that, and how we can approach that using our ears and not using a real book. So first, let's dive into the two holdover progressions from last week that I think are really important. So last week we went over the 2-5-1, the 3-6-2-5-1. We also went over being able to hear when a tune modulates to the relative minor, and then we also went over hearing when a tune modulates to the key of the 4. So the two progressions we're going to look at today are 1-6-2-5, and then the other one that we're going to look at is 4 minor 4-1. So let's start with 1-6-2-5. This is a progression that we're going to see a lot. Think rhythm changes on this one. It opens with a 1-6-2-5 progression, and it happens all over the place. The other place where this will happen is in a lot of traditional tunes. You'll hear this 1-6-2-5 all over the place, so I want to make sure that you can hear this. So we're going to do it in the key of C. This is on your PDF. It's example number 1 from your PDF this week. Let's start with the root movement. So we start with a 1, then we have a 6 chord, then 2, 5, back to 1. So it uses the circle of fourths after we hit that 6 chord. Basically, this is just like a 3-6-2-5, only we're subbing out the 1 chord for the 3 chord. So our initial movement is we either go down a minor 3rd or up a major 6th. The bass player could do either one of those things depending on where they are with their range. So you want to be able to hear that, and then as soon as we hit that 6 chord, then we kick off that circle of fourths. So one more time. Here's the 1 chord, 6, 2, 5, and 1. Now let's fill it out with the actual chords above it. One more time. So there it is. There is your 1, 6, 2, 5, 1 progression. Very, very common. You will see that literally thousands of times as you learn tunes. Okay, now the second one is a little bit less often used, but I still think it's a really, really important progression, particularly if you're playing a little bit more on the traditional end of things. This progression happens all the time in the tunes of like the 1920s through the 1940s. Of course, it still does happen a lot in more modern standards, but this was a progression that was used very, very heavily in a little bit more of those traditional style tunes. So basically, if we're in the key of C, the progression that we are going to hear is a major 4 chord, which then transitions into a minor 4 chord and then goes right back to 1. So this is a different way of getting back to the 1 chord rather than just using a 2-5-1 progression. This is one of my favorite alternate cadences that isn't just a plain 5-1 motion. So the root movement to this is really, really easy because it's just 2 notes. So you have the 4, and then you have the 4 again, and then you just go back to 1. The way that this progression is really characterized is when you fill out the chords. What you're trying to hear is that movement from the major 4 to the minor 4 and then back to 1. Okay, let's hear that again, because if you have never really heard that before, that can be kind of a tough one. Okay, so that's an F6 chord to an F minor 6 chord to a C6 chord or a C major 7 chord. You'll hear both of those things happen. So let's hear it in time. 1, 2, 3, 4. And the cool thing about this is that actually it fits together with our first progression, because very often what you're going to hear in a tune is this 4 to minor 4 to 1, and then you're going to hear 6, 2, 5, 1. So this is what it sounds like all together. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, I'm hoping that if you're at all experienced, you will have heard that before. That might be a thing that you have heard in some of the tunes that you've learned, or a lot of the music that you have listened to. That's going to be something that might be familiar to you, hopefully. Okay, so those are the 2 progressions that were kind of held over from last week that I didn't have time to go over in last week's episode. Now, the second thing that I'd like to talk to you about this week is listening to a piece of music and being able to get your head around some semblance of the form. And I'm not talking about specifics here. I'm not talking about actually figuring out the chord changes or learning the melody on your instrument. I'm simply talking about listening to a piece of music and trying your best just from listening to have an idea of what the form is. And then you can go into all the other steps of learning a tune already kind of knowing what that tune looks like from a form perspective. So I've broken this process down into basically 3 steps, and these are going to be on your PDF for the week so that you can take this and actually start putting it into action and see how you do with it. So step 1 is you put on a track, whatever tune you want to learn, and the first thing you want to think about is you want to listen to the melody, okay? And I want you to think about first, how many measures total is the form? And this should be a pretty easy thing to figure out, right? When the musician comes in with the melody, start counting, all right? And then stop counting at the end of the melody when they start to go into solos or whatever they do at the end of the melody, and simply just write down how many measures you counted. this should be pretty simple, I'm hoping, okay? So that's step one, figure out how many measures it is total. And from this information, we can glean a lot about the actual form. Like if it's 32 bars, that's gonna tell us that it might be a number of forms that are pretty typical, okay? If it's some other different amount of measures, well, then you've got some digging to do. You've got some thinking to do about what this form could possibly be. But there is step one. That's going to give us a bird's eye view of the entire form. Okay, step number two is I want you to listen to it again, and I want you to start to think if you can hear distinct sections in what you're listening to. A great way to do this is to think, do any of these sections repeat themselves? Does the melody repeat itself at any point? And how long is that section of the melody before it starts to repeat itself? Can you hear a bridge? Can you hear a part of the tune that's totally different from the beginning of the tune, right? This will start to give you a little bit more of a detailed view once you have the entire form written down, how many measures it is. Now you're going to want to start to dive in and say, all right, can I section up this form that I just listened to? Okay, start to get used to thinking this way. At first, it'll be really, really hard to hear this and be able to codify it into something in your mind. But if you do this over and over and over again, it's going to start to become second nature to you. Like so many jazz improvisation skills, figuring out form will become easier the more that you do it. Okay, and the third and final step is I want you to try to determine what key the tune is in. Now, I don't want you to worry about any key changes yet. I want to just see if you can figure out what home key the tune is in, right? So like what would the key signature be if there were a key signature? Where does the tune originate from? What key, major or minor? Now, this could actually be the hardest part, okay? So maybe you sit down a piano, or maybe you do have your instrument in your hands for this part, and you're just trying to figure out, okay, what note sounds like home? What key is this in? And if you can't figure it out at first, don't worry about it. Don't get discouraged, but do your best to figure out if you can tell what the home key of the tune is. Some tunes, this is a lot easier than other tunes, depending on factors like the melody, how clear the melody is, how simple or difficult the changes actually are. But I want you to try to do that as step 3, okay? So you should walk away from this process, first of all, having listened to the tune and the melody a whole bunch of times. You're gonna have to listen to the melody probably over a dozen times to complete these 3 steps. And that right there is gonna be awesome for you. So what you're gonna walk away from this process with is a good idea of the form. And then as we get into the more complicated steps in the process, figuring out the melody, possibly figuring out the chords, all that kind of stuff, you're already going to have this great reference that you can come back to of having figured out how many measures the form is, what maybe are the sections of the form, and also hopefully what key the tune is in. This is going to be really important information for you for the rest of the process. Okay, this episode is getting super long, but I have a final task for you. I want you to try to do this process on 3 tunes. The first tune is a little bit easier, a little bit more clear, is the tune Cheesecake by Dexter Gordon. See if you can figure out all 3 steps. Then I want you to try to figure out a little bit more of a complicated form, which is the tune Wave by Antonio Carlos Jobim. You can use any version out there that you can find. It's all going to have the same form. This one's a little bit trickier, right? There's a few more twists and turns and oddities in this. And then the third one, which is perhaps the most complicated, is I want you to try to figure out the form of Along Came Betty and use the Art Blakey recording to do this. Okay, so these are going to ratchet up in difficulty. The first one's the easiest, the second one's a little bit harder, and the third one is a lot harder. But I want you to see if you can perform this process, figure out what it takes, how many times you're going to have to listen to get this process down, and see if you can figure out all 3 steps. Maybe you can't figure out step 3 for one of the tunes. That's okay. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a post in the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson Community Facebook group where we can all discuss what we think the form is and see what kind of difficulties we're having, maybe help each other out with this process. So look for that over the weekend after this episode comes out, and we can all have a bit of a community discussion about it. Okay? All right. Sorry for the long episode, but I hope that you found some use in this information. I know I threw a lot at you. Go back and listen to the episode again if you didn't catch all that. But remember, I did write it all down on your PDF for this week. All right. I hope you're all staying safe and healthy out there as usual. Hope you're all doing well. Make sure you check in this weekend with the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson Community Facebook group for that post and discussion. And we will talk to you all soon. Have a good weekend, everybody. Bye.